But Abraham and David, two individuals of promise in the Old Testament, and that's who Matthew wants to connect Jesus to. He wants to show that Jesus, from his human perspective, comes from the right lineage. Abraham, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. There will be a descendant who would come from him, who will crush the serpent, who will be the one that will bless everyone through him. And he shows that he's connected back to Abraham in that lineage at the beginning of Matthew. But also David, because David was promised that a descendant of his would sit upon the throne forever. And that's exactly what Jesus will do. He'll be king and king forever, and he is a descendant of David. So there's this lineage that proves he comes from the right people on the human side. And then last week we talked about the virgin birth. And that's more of Matthew trying to show that not only is Jesus human and come from the right lineage that way, but he's also God. He's from God, and there is a connection to him. And so what you're seeing is Matthew's trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, and so far he's shown he's both God and man. And last week we talked about how that's an essential teaching, Jesus being both God and man. It's hard, it's a must for us to believe. It's hard for us to understand and wrap our head around a bit, how someone can be fully God and fully man, yet that's the reality we see in Jesus when he comes to earth. And so we looked at that story from the perspective of Joseph, how he was a just man, that as he was betrothed, or our equivalent to a degree is engaged, Mary's found to be pregnant. He has some decisions to make because he believes her to be unfaithful. And when he's going to divorce her and put her out, the angel of the Lord speaks to him the truth about the situation, how Mary was with child from the Holy Spirit. And so he chooses to stay with Mary, to be faithful. He hears the message of God. He trusts. He believes. And you end Matthew chapter 1 with Jesus being Emmanuel, God with us. Our Creator come to earth as a man. He knows what it's like to be human. He experiences what it's like to be human. He knows what it's like to be you and me, and he sits in all of that with us, and he understands it. Even today, as he sits on the throne in heaven, he knows what it's like to be us, and he's our advocate next to the Father, God with us. Now, if you look at Matthew chapter 2, I want to read just this one verse at the beginning. In Matthew chapter 2, and verse 1, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." Let's keep reading for a second. "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before him, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." If you know this story, why were they warned not to go back to Herod? Herod wanted to kill Jesus. He doesn't want anyone to rival him or to take power, so he's going to kill. And as I read this, and we're now getting to the point in Matthew where we're starting to learn of certain individuals who are going to play a part in this story. Coming very soon, there's going to be certain groups in this story. And so I warned you about this the first week of class. I want to take a step away from the text for a moment this morning and kind of talk about something related to this gospel. This is the question I kind of want to talk about this morning, is what was the world that Jesus entered into like? You know, Jesus comes to earth. I don't know if you ever thought about this question, but when Jesus is born, he's born into a certain environment with certain situations all around him. and they affect the groups that we see, like the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and so many others. They affect the climate of the day. They affect the way people think and believe and act. And I want to take a moment to stop and just say, what was this world like? Because God comes into the earth, and I think it will help us maybe understand some of what goes on. It will absolutely help us understand the groups that we're going to see in this book going forward if we just understand the climate of the earth that Jesus is born into. Let me ask you this. What was the world like when you entered into it? Has it not affected you to a degree? I think about this. So I have a grandma who turns, is it 95 or 96 around Christmas? I think it's 96. And my grandma, she's a treasure. She does some things, though, that are hard for me to understand. For example, you'll go to her house sometimes, and she'll, be eating sardines out of a can. And I'm like, Grandma, we can find you a better meal than that. Like, why would you eat that? And she eats, some of you are making a face like that's disgusting, and some of you are making a face like, I've done that. But there are some things that she eats, and I go, why would you subject yourself to eating that? And there's things she says sometimes, where did that come from? But then when you get to know her story, you see maybe how she was affected. My grandmother, she's almost 96, so she's born in the 1930s. What was going on in Oklahoma during that time? Everyone had a bonnet or a hoe in the 1930s. I'm going to take your word for it. But what'd you say? Okay, the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl happened in 1930. So what kind of time was it in Oklahoma in those days? Hard times. It was difficult times. There was the Dust Bowl. There's a severe drought. There's agricultural collapse. There's widespread unemployment. There is significant outmigration in Oklahoma. And what we call the Great what? Depression. Difficult times. So you had a lot of families and a lot of people who were just trying to make it by. They're just trying to use what they can and just make it by and provide for their family. I think that's when fried onion cheeseburgers were invented in Oklahoma, where we need to replace some of the meat because we don't have enough meat, and so they use onions. And thank goodness for people with imagination, because I love fried onion cheeseburgers. But that affects her a little bit. And you see some things in her life and you go, okay, the world that she grew up in affects her in different ways. And I know what you eat's not a big thing, but you get my point, don't you? I want you to think about your life for a second. What was the world like when you entered into it? What was the economy like? What was going on in your community? What was going on in your country? How did that affect the people around them? We think about generations and their different personality traits, from the greatest generation to millennials, and we sometimes look at the things that are going on and we say how it affects them. I want you to think about the people that Jesus is going to be around and ministering to when he is born onto this earth, because it absolutely affects some of their mindsets and thinking and what they're looking for. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And I just want to give you a little bit of a history of Israel so you understand what Jesus is entering into when he comes to earth as man and God. There was this. Oh, there's your Dust Bowl picture. That's dust, if you didn't know what that now. I want to give you, there are some maps here. I'm going to show a lot of maps this morning just to help you understand a little bit of the history of Israel. And that's really our goal, is just to understand this. And we might just stop there this morning, and that's okay. This is not necessarily I've never really taught a class like this. My dad's really big into history. I've never been that good at it, but I'm going to try my best to explain this in a way that you can understand. But this was a quote I read this week that I wanted to share with you. I found it very interesting. It comes from a man by the name of N.T. Wright in a book called The New Testament in Its World. He says this, and this is just kind of a map of Israel at the time of Jesus' birth. He says, "The land of Israel is a small country. You can walk its length north to south in a few days, and from its central mountains you can see its lateral boundaries, the sea to the west and the river to the east. But it has had an importance out of all proportion to its size. Empires have fought over it." Listen to this. "Every 44 years out of all the last 4,000, on average, an army has marched through it, whether to conquer it, to rescue it from someone else, to use it as a neutral battleground on which to fight a different enemy, or to take advantage of it as the natural route for getting somewhere else to fight there instead. There are many places which once beautiful are now battered and mangled with the legacies of war, and yet it has remained a beautiful land, still producing grapes and figs, milk and honey. We talk about Israel. It's not the biggest of places. I mean, you've been there and some others, and in our head it's big. I'm not saying it's the smallest place, but it's not. I had to drive from Austin, Texas Friday to Oklahoma. I'm pretty sure that's a lot more land. It's not the biggest of places, but that's kind of bewildering that every 44 years on average for the past 4,000, an army has marched through it. Can you imagine that? Has any of us ever lived in a place where an army was in it, marching through it to conquer it? No. This absolutely affects the history of these people and of this nation, is affecting the way they think and see and what they're looking for in a Messiah. And so what you find in the 400 to 500 years before Jesus' birth is you find Israel, for most of the time, is under the thumb of one oppressor or another. And this might be hard for us to understand, but I think it's important for us to understand what's going on. So this is what it's like in the time of Jesus, but when you look at Israel's history leading up to Jesus, really we could start at Babylonian captivity. There's a section in your scriptures in the Old Testament where you get to where part of Israel is taken to Babylonian captivity. This is from about the year 597 BC to 539. King Nebuchadnezzar, he conquers Judea in 597. By 587, that's just 10 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed. That includes the first temple. Okay, that's not just, they destroyed a building. That is the center of religious life in Judaism. That is where they all went to sacrifice and worship, and they had these pilgrimages and these days and all. This is a huge thing for the temple to be destroyed. This is like the Mecca for them, of where they go. This is where they worship, and this is a huge thing, and it's destroyed. And not only is it destroyed, but it's called Babylonian captivity for a reason. A large portion of the inhabitants of Israel were then taken to Babylon in captivity. Here's a map. This green area, that would be Babylon, what they controlled. If you notice, there's kind of that red line, Judea to the left, Babylon to the right. That was their path of exile. And so there's not every Jew, but many Jews, especially when you read Daniel, they took the best Jews, the best of the best, and they tried to assimilate them into a new culture. But they take this long trek into captivity. And so starting in about 597, Israel starts to be under the thumb of one oppressor or another. Now I want you to think about how that would make people think and react when you are God's covenant people, right? You're the nation that belongs to God. You're his covenant. He's your God. And you go from having a king and being a nation that knows what it's like to be on top and having these great, big, successful times to then being enslaved or in captivity by another nation who you consider to be idolatrous and pagan and many other things. Do you think you would question a little bit? Has God forsaken us? Will God remember us? There's a lot of there's a big question mark on the faith of people. The temple's been destroyed. The Jews have been removed. Has God forsaken us? And although it might have seemed like that to some, this was prophesied about. And in fact, the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah in our scriptures, they would speak of a future day when God would bring them back from exile, a time when God would deliver them through a new exodus with a new king and a new temple and the renewal of the covenant with God returning to dwell in the new temple. And just over 50 years later, this promise came partly true. Now, even with that, 50 years you go, okay, that's not that bad, but think about our lives. 50 years. I mean, that's our life. That's most of our life, and yet some of these people spend most of their life in exile. Has God forgotten us? Has God forsaken us? I didn't go to the game yesterday, so I shouldn't be losing my voice. I had nothing to yell about either. But you have this period from 597 to 539, and this lasts until Persia comes in, and then Persia defeats Babylon. They were led by the Persian king Cyrus, and this brought in what we'll call, that's just another map of the same thing, that's the Babylonian Empire. But this leads up to then the Persian and Greek period. And this is kind of two different groups that will control this area of Israel, or sometimes referred to as Palestine back then. And the Persian-Greek period from 538 to 323 BC. So the Persians, they take over, and compared to the Babylonians, they are nice overlords. Now that sounds like a funny statement, nice overlords. But they're more generous to the Jewish people. Why? They allowed them to go back. So when you read in your Old Testament about, when you read Ezra and Nehemiah, that's kind of this period. You remember Nehemiah, they were allowed to go back and rebuild. The wall was rebuilt. The temple was rebuilt. Ezra, when you read that book, you find a lot of religious reform happening when they are now getting back to being faithful to God and His covenant. And so you see a lot of that in those books as you read them. But this period, first it's the Persians, and they're more generous overlords. They permit them to go back to their homeland, to rebuild the temple, but they did remain their overlords. I mean, they were in control. And so you find those stories there in Ezra and Nehemiah. They're also partly or spoken of in some way in the prophetic books of Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi and Daniel and some others. But this period included this great rebuilding and this trying to kind of, let's establish who we are again. Let's get back, although they're still being controlled by somebody. So this is a positive. They were under the thumb of one oppressor, but while they're still under the thumb of one, at least they get to go back. And so it seems like a victory to a degree, but it's not a full victory because the full glorious sweep of all of the prophetic promises about Israel's restoration had not yet fully materialized. The 12 tribes, they had not been regathered. There's no new Davidic king like David who's going to be in control and in power. No, that's not the case. Their ruler is an emperor from some other group of people. The rebuilt temple, it's rebuilt, but it's in pale comparison to the one that Solomon that had built his original temple. Nations were not swarming to Zion to worship God, and unrighteousness was still around and abounding. And it was sin that led them into exile, and there's still unrighteousness in the people and in the land. And so the Jews find themselves living under the rule of one pagan king after another. We're now to the year 323. It's over 200 years of being oppressed. Can you imagine that? That's hard for us to, but yet that's their situation. In 336 BC, Alexander the Great rose to power. And Alexander the Great, he conquers place after place and people after people. And what Alexander did is when he conquered a place, he would bring along his culture with him. That's what he did. It's not just, we're going to take this land and let you be you. We're going to take this land, but we're going to introduce everything about us, and we want you to believe this. And so this will be Hellenization is what occurs, starting in Alexander the Great's time. But in 336 BC, Alexander the Great rises to power. And this is all of the area that Alexander the Great and his empire is going to control. So he just takes over. Wherever they went, they would bring their culture along with them. So his empire sweeps through the old Persian Empire and beyond, and it changes the cultural landscape and they impose Greek culture wherever they went. This empire stretched from Greece to India, and Greek language and culture permeated every part of it. Now, what's the issue with that? It's not wrong to speak a different language, but what's the challenge with that? That he introduces this whole new language and culture and everything else into this group of people in this land. What's the challenge that they now face as Israelites? Communication, okay. I think there's some more challenge. I want you to think about this. You're God's covenant people. Do you have a way you're supposed to live? You got a way of doing things? You got a system you've been given, all of this kind of thing? And you look at this group of people, are they faithful to the God of Israel? No, they're pagan people. There's gods and goddesses, and there's all different things about their culture. What? Immorality. There's immorality. We see some of the worship of them, and it's very sinful. And yet, the point is, they bring all of this new culture. And, culture's not a negative thing. We're a melting pot here in America. It's part of what makes America beautiful. There's different groups and there's different thoughts and things, and we all blend together. What I'm talking about here is a little different because here you have some sinful things that come in, and when there's an emperor under your kind of pushing you down, what do you feel as the people of Israel? Is there not a little bit of a pressure to assimilate? Yeah, Larry, your hand up.
I was going to say idol worship.
Idol worship. That's the stuff we're talking about. They're under this thumb, and it's, hey, here's this new culture and language, and there's this pressure, and there's a pressure to assimilate, and that's now what they're facing. If you ever wondered this, what was the language that you would think Israelites speak naturally? Most Israelites? Hebrew. But yet in Jesus' time, what's the common language of the day? Why does everyone speak Greek, even in Israel? Because when Alexander the Great comes in, he pushes this culture and language on everyone that by the time Jesus is alive as a man, that's just kind of common everywhere. That was the common language of the day. And so what you're seeing is just another group that's now, in control of this of Israel, and is putting this pressure on the people. And so from this point on, the world was kind of Greek to a degree. That doesn't mean that there wasn't any faithful Jews. That doesn't mean there wasn't any Jewish culture going, but it's just Greek had a huge influence on everything going on. By the first century, when we fast forward to Jesus' time, there were 3 times as many Jews living outside of Israel or Palestine as there were in it. Just from everything that's happened. There's been mass exodus, there's been push out, there's been a lot of things going on. That affects the people we're going to see in the Gospel of Matthew. And so it's called Hellenization, where you're trying to, this kind of adopting of Greek culture or this pushing of Greek culture. You'll find in your Bible sometimes Hellenistic Jews. That's Jews who've kind of adopted the Greek way of living. That's what you're seeing in this pressure to go about. So this setting, it forms this kind of threat religiously and culturally that's every bit as powerful as this threat politically. It's not just they're going to take our land and what might they do, but they're changing the faith. They're trying to change the people. You ever looked out in our world, in our culture, and you said that's a threat to Christians? That influence or that thing's trying to pull Christians away? They face this in a very real way by what was going on in the world. And so you had people who might have been threatened to adopt this culture in various ways. They might just kind of participate in maybe a token way in Greek civic life, but then there maybe have been some that just apostatized and left Judaism. And so that's what you're facing at this time. And when Alexander the Great dies, does anyone know what he did with all of this area that he controlled? He divided it up among his generals. Okay, well, so it's not the biggest history buff, but there you go. No, you're okay. It's divided up, and what I was going to show you is, well, that's Alexander the Great. You have these kind of 2 periods for Israel, where during the next, 120 years, there's 2 of these areas that have been divided up, where the generals, and there's fighting, and we'll talk about that in a second, that they both kind of control this area for a while. So it's not like Alexander dies and then there's freedom. I don't know how to pronounce this word. I think the P is silent. No? Potomac. Okay, I'm so worried about saying that word as an Oklahoman. Potomac period. This is from 320 to 200. And this is this area. So you'll see that yellow portion. That is the area in which we're talking about that would control Palestine at this time. This period is for about 120 years, and they control this area until the year till the year 200, and from then, at the year 200, that blue area, the Seleucids Empire. Thank you. See, I need all the help I can get pronouncing things. I need a translator up here this morning. The Seleucids, they then take over. As Martin said, these groups fought against each other. It wasn't like, well, they were all generals under the Great and they just got along. No, they fought. And as we said, they would use Palestine as an area as a buffer state against the other. They would use it as a place to fight. They would use it as a place then to travel to go fight other battles. And so if you're Israel, you ever gotten a gift and you for Christmas and you had no use for it, so you gave it away to someone else, like a gift exchange? You just kind of rewrapped it. This is kind of what's happening to these people right now. It's like they want you, and now they got you, and they got you, and the only person that doesn't seem to control Israel is Israel for a long period of time. It's under the Seleucid period and that empire that some very significant things occur. So in 167 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he was seeking to establish Judea as a buffer state against Egypt to the south. And what he attempted to do was exert control over the country both politically and religiously. And so he decided to do this by force through Hellenization, but also trying to eliminate the Jewish religion. He would outlaw Jewish practices. He would desecrate the temple with pagan altars. Instead of worshiping God, you could worship him instead. And the Jews, they were a pretty tenacious people. They did not back down. And there's a specific event in this time period that's quite famous. Anyone know what it is? It's called the Maccabean Revolt. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's quite an important thing in Jewish history. And the reason why maybe don't hear about this is because there's those years of silence in our Bible where there's not a prophet who speaks and inspired in our canon. There's not a prophet who speaks, and we have this section where it goes from Malachi and there's nothing to then the Gospels. Well, this is what happened in this period of time, in that time of silence. But this Maccabean Revolt, Judas Maccabeus and his companions, they accomplished the unthinkable. They organized an insurgency that routed and eventually wore down the Seleucids, and that's known as the Maccabean Revolt. And by the year 164 BC, the Jews recaptured Jerusalem. They rededicate the temple, right? They commemorate this as Hanukkah. That's that holiday. They commemorate what happened there. And then they establish what they call the Hasmonean dynasty. Where are we at? There we are. The Hasmonean dynasty. It's just kind of a big thing for the Jews because they go from someone has their thumb over them over and over and over again, and then they get a period of about 100 years of independence. They fight back. They win independence. What you find is what you see here, if you could see that well, is just over this period, it kind of expands the territory back out a little bit. That's what you find. And so this was 100 years that this took place, their period of independence. You would think that's a big, big victory, right? You think they would just be so overjoyed and celebratory and things would be great, and it's like Israel's back on the rise, right? And it doesn't last longer than 100 years. Does anyone know why? Well, we say Rome, but the first thing is infighting and civil wars, and it's fighting amongst themselves. I'm not saying they would have beat Rome, if they all were united, but the point is they didn't keep it together themselves. There's a few things here. So the leaders of this dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty, basically it was all of the leaders of the revolt. Their heirs, their family just became the leaders. And what they did is they kind of became these like priest kings. There was that position of priest in the Old Testament, and then you had kings. Well, they kind of just merged the two, and they're like these high priest or priest kings. I don't know if I have that. I don't have that chart up there, but what you find is there's these internal power struggles. There's these political machinations, and they kind of eat away at the kingdom's strength, and it starts to crumble under civil wars, even as it faced external threats. There's Rome, there's the Parthians that are kind of on the outside or growing, or there's these powers externally, but they're just fighting themselves. And so what happens is Rome will take advantage of that. Which, by the way, if you're a Jew, while they were happy to have their independence, these leaders they had during this dynasty were not like the idyllic leaders that they wanted. You ever looked at that in your country? And you're like, these are not the leaders I wish for. Like, I wish it was different. Well, that's what they would feel this way. Because you had some that were really bothered by, why are they priest kings? They've kind of taken God's design that we saw in the Old Testament and they've changed it. And there's a lot of political things they don't enjoy. And there's still other stuff going on in the land. There was this blending of religious and political power in ways that alienated some of the Jews. You still see that in the Gospel of Matthew, don't you? You see people who kind of blend political and religious power for their own benefit. That's something you see even then. But while independence was a victory, the prophecies were not all fulfilled. Hellenism was still rampant, and it seemed like there was another victory needed to come. And so they're vulnerable, and that's who we bring about, Rome. And Rome comes in, and Rome will conquer and be in control over Israel, and they will be in control until what happens to Jerusalem? It's destroyed again. And Rome had been building power for quite some time. In the year 63, the Roman general Pompey, he kind of exploited all of that infighting with the Hasmoneans, and he seized Jerusalem, and he ended their sovereignty. If you want to know how the Israelites felt about Rome, when Pompey visited Jerusalem after conquering it, he visited the temple. And you know what he did when he got there? He walked into the Holy of Holies. Who's supposed to go in the Holy of Holies? High priest. Who else? Nobody. This was like the biggest disrespect, kind of slap in the face. They just kind of had no regard in some ways for the Jews and their faith and their practices. And so they were not fans of the Romans, as you can see in the Gospels and as we'll look at in this Gospel in the time in this class going forward. But they become a client state under Rome. You know, they're taxed. The Rome's there. And they kind of allow them in some ways to do their thing. They put certain people in power. We're going to get to how Herod becomes in power. And they allow them to kind of rule. But at the end of the day, Rome's always the one everyone has to answer to. And Rome's the one who taxes them. And they're just under this thumb once again. And so I want to get to this. Well, this is the Roman Empire. See, just large group. Israel's all the way over here on the right. You see Judea and Syria. So it's quite the power. By the way, it's interesting. We look at some of these great powers, and what's common about all of them? They all fell. Nations crumble, the Lord doesn't. But what you find is Rome takes over. And I just want you to think about this question. Oh, that's not supposed to be there. What was it like to be a Jew in the time of Jesus? And I want you to think about how do those 400 to 500 years of history, how would that affect the Israelites and a Jew in the time of Jesus? What do you think? If you've been under the thumb of oppressor or empire after empire after empire, what are you longing for? Salvation. Someone said a leader. You said who?
You read about the Messiah coming to deliver us.
The Messiah. They are longing for a Messiah. There's a reason they're always looking for him. Because all they've been in is captivity and then oppressed. And time again, they're longing for the day where someone comes and redeems them and saves them. And we look at the Gospels. What was one of the misunderstandings about the Messiah that the Jewish people always had? That he was going to come and rule in what way? Physically. Do you understand why? Partially? Like, yes, because they misinterpret some of the scriptures, but also because that's what they've experienced for 400 to 500 years of just this over and over and over again. And so what it was like to be an Israelite in this time was it was kind of like there was this daily tension in a way. One, they're supposed to live this divinely mandated life of purity, of covenant, and of temple worship. All the while, they're being ruled by a foreign, often insensitive, pagan superpower that threatens to undermine the very foundations of their faith. It's a difficult time. And this intense political and spiritual climate, it creates this fertile ground for messianic hopes and religious movements, which is why you see a lot of religious movements, which is why you see a lot of, remember Jesus would say, false messiahs will come. And that even when Jesus comes, it's like they're used to other people claiming to be the Messiah. It's because there's a fertile ground for this. So they're all expecting it. They're looking for it. There's people claiming it. There's groups that we're going to see who have different thoughts about how we can restore Israel back to its place. There's groups who are going to side with more of the political side of things. There's groups who are going to say we need to be more devoted to Torah. There's all kinds of groups. But this is what's happening because of their history. And so they look back at their forefathers and they long for these days. They've been oppressed. And there was this great moment of independence, yet just to be under the thumb of someone else again. And they're looking for a Messiah. And that's the world that Jesus is born into. And I know some of you might be thinking, that's a lot of history, and that's not my thing. And I totally get it, because I'm way more comfortable with just reading a chapter and going into those verses. But I think it's important for us to understand what's going on in the world that Jesus is born into. Because it has an impact, does it not? Maybe it makes you think a little bit differently about the people we're going to see and what's going on in this time. I think about Isaiah chapter 61 and verse 1 and 2. And this is a verse that is quoted in the Gospel of Luke about Jesus as he comes. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus comes to earth, and he's about to make a way, and he's going to preach the good news to the poor, liberty, freedom to the captives. This maybe not in the way that some of these people thought. But that is what it was like to be a Jew in the time of Jesus. And I think for us it's a little different, because I've never lived in a place where I've felt oppressed. And I've never been under the thumb. Some of you might say, we're taxed, but not the thumb like they are. And this is a very big influence on everything going around. Anyone have any thoughts or questions about that? Yeah.
At this time, weren't there people professing to be the Messiah?
Yeah, there are people, all the way through. In the same way that people today still claim things like that, or, the world's going to end tomorrow. Like some of those predictions, or this is me, or this is what's happening, you find that all the way through. I don't know if some of these people had Messiah fatigue. There's another one, another guy claiming to be it. People are hopeful, and they're looking for someone. There may be a lot of skepticism to some degree, because they've seen quite a few people who claim it. But there's definitely people who are claiming to be Messiah throughout, before that time, and beyond. Even after Jesus' time, some claim to be the Messiah. So, but yes. Any other questions? Yeah, comments. That's also, you can also comment.
Yeah. One of the interesting things you talk about in history is that God already had spelled out all of this before it even happened. Go back and read the book of Daniel. It's a roadmap of exactly what you said. Everything fits in there perfectly.
Yeah,
God's in control.
Yeah, the book of Daniel kind of shows us there's that statue made of different materials.
The king of the north, king of the south. That's the Ptolemies and the Seleucids.
Yeah. So Daniel kind of gives you this prophecy, this blueprint of what's going to happen. They don't always understand this, some of the people, but yet we can go back and see that. So I know that's a lot of history, but I just wanted to help you kind of understand what the world was like that Jesus entered into, because I think it makes an impact when you see how Jesus lives and acts and the reactions of people. I don't want to spend 2 minutes jumping into the next section when we don't have time to cover that enough. So we'll pick up in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1 next week. And I wanted to do that because I think that helps bring us to understand this Herod guy. And we got to talk about him a little bit, because he had some accomplishments, but he was kind of a wicked fella. Just did a lot of nasty, nasty things. And you see that there in chapter 2 for sure. So we'll stop right there. I thank you for your attention. I appreciate you. And we'll take a break until worship time.